In the long sweep of history, there are moments so strange, so unsettling, that they seem closer to nightmare than reality. One such moment took place in Rome in the year 897, inside the sacred walls of the Lateran Basilica. There, under flickering candlelight, a pope sat upon a throne, dressed in full papal regalia. But he was not alive. His flesh was pale, his body stiff, his voice forever silent. Was the corpse of Pope Formosus, exhumed from his tomb, placed before a council of bishops, and put on trial as if death itself were no barrier to accusation. The spectacle would be remembered as the Cadaver Synod, a grotesque theater of vengeance that shocked even a city hardened by centuries of violence and intrigue. To understand how the papacy reached such a point, how Rome's sacred office descended into this macabre parody of justice, we must step back into the 9th century, a world of collapsing empires, clashing dynasties, and a papacy caught in the crossfire. The story of the Cadaver Synod is not only the story of one pope's humiliation, but of an entire age when power was fragile, legitimacy contested, and even the dead were not safe from the politics of the living. Rome in the late 9th century lived in the shadow of its own former majesty. The streets that once echoed with the footsteps of legions were quieter now, the grand forums reduced to fragments of stone, the aqueducts broken, and the basilicas standing like solemn reminders of better days. Yet for all its decline, no other city in Christendom carried the same aura of authority and danger. Rome was still the city of St. Peter, the seat of the papacy, the sacred place where emperors came to be crowned. And yet, beneath this veneer of sanctity, the city was torn apart by rivalries so bitter that they would eventually produce one of the strangest and most grotesque episodes in all of medieval history: the Cadaver Synod. The papacy of the 9th century was not the stable institution it was meant to be. Theoretically, it was the spiritual center of the Christian world, a beacon of continuity stretching back to the apostles. In practice, it had become a prize in a ruthless struggle among Roman aristocrats, foreign emperors, and ambitious clerics. A pope could rise to glory with the backing of a noble family or an imperial patron, and fall within months when fortunes shifted. Some were poisoned, some strangled, others dragged from their thrones and replaced by rivals. To wear the papal crown in this era was less a sign of divine favor than an invitation to intrigue and danger. Rome itself reflected the chaos. It was a city wedged between two worlds. To the east, the Byzantine Empire still claimed to be the true heir of Rome, its emperors styling themselves as defenders of orthodoxy. To the north, the descendants of Charlemagne sought to control the papacy through the might of the Carolingian Empire. Both sides tried to use the popes as pawns in their larger games of legitimacy. Within the city, powerful Roman families schemed endlessly, each hoping to place their own candidate on the throne of St. Peter. In this atmosphere of suspicion and rivalry, one man's name began to stand out. His name was Formosus, which in Latin meant well-formed or handsome. He began his career as the Bishop of Porto, a post near Rome, and from the start he distinguished himself by his skill in diplomacy. He was trusted with sensitive missions to Bulgaria, Constantinople, and the Frankish courts. His eloquence, his ability to charm kings and princes, and his reputation for intelligence made him a figure whose influence extended far beyond the borders of his small diocese. But such success carried its own dangers. In Rome, talent and ambition drew enemies as surely as it drew admiration. Formosus was respected abroad but feared at home. To some, he seemed like a man destined for the papacy, and in the fractured politics of the city, that made him a threat. Whispers spread that he was conspiring, that he had ambitions beyond his station, that he was seeking power at the expense of others. These suspicions hardened into open hostility under Pope John VIII, a strong and suspicious ruler who saw in Formosus not an ally but a rival. In 876, John accused Formosus of deserting his bishopric and aspiring unlawfully to the papacy. The charges were deeply political, yet they carried weight. Formosus was excommunicated, stripped of his priestly functions, and ordered never to set foot in Rome again. For most men, this would have been the end. Excommunication was a form of civil death. It destroyed reputations, cut off allies, and left the victim defenseless against enemies. Many a bishop would have faded into obscurity or been quietly eliminated. But Formosus was not an ordinary man. He endured. He withdrew, survived in exile, and waited for the tides of fortune to shift, as they always did in Rome. His patience was rewarded when Pope John VIII himself fell victim to assassination in 882, a brutal reminder of the city's volatility. With John's death, Formosus's exile ended. He was restored to his position as Bishop of Porto and returned to the city he had once been forbidden to enter. His survival in itself was proof of his resilience, his ability to navigate the dangers of a world where few lasted long. The years that followed were years of turbulence for the papacy as a whole. Popes came and went with alarming speed, some lasting only months. Formosus watched, maneuvered, and built alliances, particularly with Arnulf of Carinthia, the Carolingian ruler who aspired to be crowned emperor. When the opportunity came in 891, after years of survival and maneuvering, Formosus was elected pope. As pope, he faced a Rome still fractured and a papal state beset by enemies. The Spoletan dukes, one of Italy's most powerful families, pressed their claim over the papacy. Formosus, true to his nature, looked for allies beyond Rome. He turned to Arnulf, and in 896, he crowned him Holy Roman Emperor in Rome itself, hoping to secure a protector strong enough to resist Spoletan influence. For a moment it seemed as though Formosus had succeeded, that he had found a way to anchor the papacy between its many enemies. But the triumph was short-lived. Arnulf, soon after his coronation, was struck down by a sudden illness and forced to retreat north. Rome was left defenseless, and the Spoletan faction, enraged by Formosus's actions, prepared to take their revenge. In April of 896, Formosus himself died. His death might have seemed the natural end of a stormy career, the closing of a chapter marked by brilliance, intrigue, and survival against the odds. Yet in Rome, even death was no guarantee of peace. But as enemies, his passing was not enough. Formosus had crowned their rival, undermined their power, and filled the church with men ordained under his authority. His legacy lived on in every decree, every appointment, every alliance he had forged. To allow his memory to stand unchallenged was to leave their own position insecure. They needed more than his death. They needed his disgrace. Thus, within a year of his burial in the Basilica of St. Peter, plans began to form for a spectacle so grotesque that it would shock even the cynical Romans of that era. The dead pope would not rest quietly in his tomb. He would be dragged from it, placed before his successors, and tried as though he were alive. The stage was being set for the Cadaver Synod, a trial that would forever stain the history of the papacy and become a symbol of its darkest age. The months after Formosus's death were filled with whispers and unease. His body lay buried in the grandeur of St. Peter's, but his shadow stretched across Rome. Every decree he had issued, every bishop he had consecrated, every political maneuver he had made, lived on in the fragile web of alliances he had spun. His enemies, particularly the Spoletan faction, saw danger in allowing his legacy to stand. If his acts were left intact, then his coronation of Arnulf as emperor would remain valid, his supporters in the episcopacy would remain legitimate, and the delicate balance of power in Rome would tilt against them. For the Spoletans, this could not be tolerated. To weaken Formosus's influence, they needed not only to undermine his memory, but to obliterate it. The new pope, Stephen VI, was their instrument. Stephen had his own complicated history. He was no stranger to the violent tides of Roman politics and no innocent victim of manipulation. To hold power at all in Rome required compromise with dangerous patrons, and Stephen owed his seat to the Spoletans. Their hands had lifted him to the throne of Peter, and their voices pressed upon him in expectation. If they demanded the humiliation of Formosus, Stephen could not easily refuse. Still, there is reason to believe that even he understood the madness of what was about to unfold. To put a corpse on trial was to cross a line into the surreal, to turn justice into a spectacle, faith into farce. And yet, in the volatile climate of Rome, such spectacles often held a brutal logic. The order was given, Late in 896 or early 897, gravediggers descended into the crypt of St. Peter's. There they opened the tomb of Formosus. 9 months had passed since his death. His body, clothed in papal vestments, had decayed, but not to dust. The cadaver was lifted from its resting place and carried into the light, a grotesque relic of a pontiff whose name still inspired both loyalty and hatred. For the people of Rome, the very sight must have been chilling. Death was a familiar presence in their lives, but never in such a context. To see a pope exhumed, not for veneration, not for relics, but for trial, twisted the sacred into the grotesque. Preparations were made in the Lateran Basilica, Rome's great cathedral. There, in the hall where synods and councils were normally convened, a throne was placed. Upon this throne, the corpse of Formosus was seated. His papal robes were arranged over his stiffened frame, his mitre placed upon his head, his crozier set in his decayed hands. What emerged was a grim parody of papal majesty, a puppet dressed in the trappings of power, a body robbed of dignity to serve as the centerpiece of a ritual of vengeance. The bishops and clerics summoned to the synod must have felt the surreal weight of what was unfolding. They gathered in solemn rows, their faces lit by candlelight, the smell of decay wafting through the basilica. Before them sat the corpse of a man they had once known, a pope who had spoken, issued decrees, crowned an emperor. Now he was voiceless, yet still accused. A deacon was appointed to speak on his behalf, a cruel formality. The role of this unlucky cleric was not to defend Formosus in truth, but to serve as a kind of grim ventriloquist, answering questions posed to a body that could not respond. The charges leveled against the dead pope were serious in their wording, but transparent in their purpose. He was accused of violating canon law by transferring from the See of Porto to the See of Rome, something forbidden by church custom. He was accused of perjury, of ambition, of unlawfully usurping the papacy itself. Beneath the legal jargon lay the raw truth. His enemies wished his papacy erased. If the court declared him guilty, then all he had done as pope could be undone. Bishops he had consecrated could be stripped of legitimacy, decrees he had issued annulled, and, most importantly, the coronation of Arnulf invalidated. In this way, the Spoletans hoped to erase not just the man, but the very impact of his years in power. The spectacle unfolded with a grim inevitability. Stephen VI, presiding as judge, berated the corpse with bitter fury. Accounts tell us he shouted at the body, mocking it, condemning it, demanding answers from lips that could no longer move. The deacon, trembling, spoke the responses, words that no doubt rang hollow in the ears of those assembled. There was no suspense, no genuine trial. The verdict was preordained. Formosus was declared guilty of all charges. What followed was not merely legal annulment, but deliberate desecration. The papal robes were ripped from his corpse. The 3 fingers of his right hand, those he had used for blessings, were hacked off. This act carried heavy symbolism. To cut away the fingers of benediction was to say that all his blessings, all his sacraments, all his ordinations were void. His body, once again reduced to a pitiable shell, was dragged from the throne and cast aside. Later, it would be thrown into a pauper's grave, and finally into the Tiber River itself, as though the city sought to wash itself clean of his memory. The people of Rome, hardened as they were by violence and scandal, were not unmoved. The trial shocked even them. To see the dignity of the papal office mocked in such a fashion, to see death itself treated as a political weapon, stirred unease and outrage. Whispers spread in the streets that the trial was sacrilege, that it invited divine wrath. The clergy who had presided must have felt it too, that they had crossed a boundary from politics into blasphemy, from intrigue into nightmare. Yet in that moment, for Stephen VI and his Spoletan patrons, the goal had been achieved. Formosus had been condemned, his memory besmirched, his papacy declared null. They had written him out of the history of the Church, or so they thought. But Rome was a city where power shifted as quickly as rumor, and vengeance was never complete. Within months, the same outrage that had been unleashed against Formosus would turn against Stephen himself. The aftermath of the Cadaver Synod lingered in the air like a foul stench. Rome had witnessed many horrors, but the image of a pope's corpse, dressed in sacred vestments, mocked and mutilated before the clergy, was not one that could be easily forgotten. The trial had been meant to destroy the memory of Formosus, to weaken his supporters and solidify Spoletan influence, but instead it produced unease and revulsion. Ordinary Romans, who had already endured years of chaos and scandal in the papacy, murmured openly about sacrilege. To desecrate the body of a bishop was shocking enough. To desecrate the corpse of a pope was to risk the wrath of God himself. The desecrated remains of Formosus, after being tossed from his throne and mutilated, were dragged through the streets and buried in an unmarked grave. Even this was not the end. Soon afterward, as if his enemies feared even the presence of his bones, his body was dug up again and hurled into the waters of the Tiber. To the Spoletans, this was symbolic erasure, a final act of contempt. The river would carry him away, leaving no relic, no tomb, no resting place. But the Romans, who lived close to both faith and superstition, whispered that the river did not accept him. Stories spread that the corpse washed back onto the banks, retrieved by monks in secret, hidden away in holy ground. Whether or not this was true, it revealed something deeper: the people's instinctive recoil against what had been done. Stephen VI, who had presided over the trial, might have imagined himself secure when the verdict was delivered. He had satisfied the Spoletan dukes who had elevated him, demonstrated his loyalty by humiliating their enemy, and cleared a legal path to invalidate Formosus's ordinations. But security in Rome was always an illusion. The anger that had been directed at Formosus now rebounded upon Stephen. The grotesque spectacle had wounded the dignity of the church itself, and in a city where spiritual and political life were inseparable, this was dangerous. Opposition gathered quickly. Clergy who had once obeyed out of fear now whispered against him. Laymen grumbled that Rome had been cursed by blasphemy. Even some of Stephen's allies must have realized that the trial had gone too far, that they had crossed into territory that could not be justified even by politics. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, a riot broke out in Rome, and Stephen was seized. Stripped of his office, he was thrown into prison. There, abandoned by his protectors, he met the fate that had claimed so many popes before him. He was strangled to death in his cell. The fall of Stephen VI did not erase the damage. Rome remained unstable, the papacy caught in a storm of shifting factions. Yet the memory of the Cadaver Synod hung over everything that followed. It became a symbol of how far corruption and vengeance could push even the holiest of institutions. Later popes would attempt to undo its consequences. The acts of Formosus were reinstated, his ordinations revalidated. The Church, embarrassed by the grotesque spectacle, tried to pretend it had never happened, or at least that it had been the work of madmen in a time of chaos. But the people remembered. To them, the Cadaver Synod was not merely an oddity of canon law or the maneuvering of aristocrats. It was an omen, a visible sign that the papacy itself had been degraded, that holy offices had been dragged down into the mud of politics, in taverns and markets, in the shadows of ruined forums. They spoke of curses, of divine anger, of a city damned by its own sins. Formosus himself, though long dead, became a figure of strange power in these memories. To some, he was a martyr of politics, a pope who had been persecuted even beyond the grave. To others, he was a symbol of the dangers of ambition, a reminder that Rome devoured not only the living, but also the dead. His story did not end with his trial. The Synod had given him a second life, one he never asked for, in the nightmares and imaginations of the Romans who had witnessed it. Even centuries later, when chroniclers looked back on the dark age of the papacy, it was the Cadaver Synod that stood out, as though all the murders, the intrigues, and the scandals of the age were somehow summed up in that one ghastly moment when a corpse was placed on trial. It revealed not just the corruption of individuals, but the fragility of institutions, the way that sacred authority could be twisted into theater, the way that vengeance could disguise itself as justice. The fall of Stephen VI was swift, but the chaos did not end with him. Rome would continue to see popes rise and fall with dizzying speed. Yet from this moment onward, the papacy carried a new scar. Even as new leaders tried to restore dignity, the memory of the trial of Formosus lingered, a warning of how far Rome had fallen and how much further it might still descend. The death of Stephen VI did little to restore order in Rome. His strangling in a prison cell was almost routine in a city where popes came and went with unsettling rapidity, but the memory of the Cadaver Synod remained like a wound that refused to heal. For the clergy who had participated, there was unease. For the noble families who had supported it, there was regret mixed with stubbornness. And for the common people, there was outrage. Rome, already battered by famine, plague, and political strife, seemed to carry the added burden of sacrilege. The spectacle had not merely humiliated a corpse, it had humiliated the papacy itself, and by extension the entire city. The months that followed saw new popes elevated in rapid succession. Roman politics was too fractured to allow for stability, and each faction sought to undo what the other had done. When Theodore II ascended to the papacy in December of 1897, his reign lasted only about 20 days, but in that short span, he moved to reverse the grotesque judgment of his predecessor. He ordered Formosus's body to be retrieved from the Tiber, an act that carried more symbolic weight than political advantage. According to accounts, monks or fishermen discovered the corpse, lodged along the riverbank. Despite the time that had passed, it was said to be remarkably intact, as if preserved by divine will. To a city steeped in omens and portents, this discovery was not mere coincidence, but a sign. The body was brought back to St. Peter's Basilica and reinterred with honor. In the act, Theodore sought to restore not only the dignity of Formosus, but the dignity of the papal office itself. The Cadaver Synod was annulled, its verdicts erased. Formosus's ordinations and decrees were once again considered valid. It was a brief moment of healing, but it was fragile. Theodore's sudden death, whether from illness or intrigue, meant that his corrections could easily be overturned by the next faction to seize the throne. His successor, John Nix, continued in the same spirit. Convening synods in Ravenna and elsewhere, he confirmed the reversal of the Cadaver Synod, forbade the trial of corpses, and even ordered that official records of the grotesque proceedings be destroyed, as though Rome could erase the memory of what had happened by blotting out the documents. Yet memories could not be so easily purged. The people remembered. The people remembered. The clergy remembered. Chroniclers remembered. No decree could make them forget the sight of a pope's corpse in judgment robes seated on a throne. Despite John IX's efforts, the underlying causes of the chaos remained unresolved. The Spoletan dukes still exerted influence, the Carolingian dynasty was still fracturing in the north, and Rome's noble families continued their feuds. When John IX died in 900, the city once again spiraled into instability. Within a few years, yet another Pope, Sergius III, rose to power, and with him came a return to the rhetoric of the Cadaver Synod. Sergius had been a partisan of the Spoletans, and though he did not repeat the macabre trial, he declared its verdict valid once more, condemning Formosus anew. This whiplash of memory, condemnation, rehabilitation, condemnation again, reflected the deeper instability of the age. Each faction sought to control not only the present but the past. To declare Formosus legitimate or illegitimate was not simply to pass judgment on a man long dead, but to decide whether the bishops he ordained were lawful, whether the emperors he crowned were valid, whether the entire chain of authority derived from him had meaning. In medieval thought, legitimacy was not a mere detail. It was the bedrock on which kingdoms, sacraments, and souls rested. The Cadaver Synod, bizarre as it seemed, had left cracks in that foundation, and the Church spent decades trying to repair them. For the faithful, the repeated overturning of judgments only deepened the sense of unease. A pope one year declared holy, the next condemned, then restored, then condemned again. What stability, what divine guidance could be trusted in such a whirlwind? To many, it was evidence of corruption so deep that it could no longer be hidden. For others, it was a test of faith, proof that even the highest office in Christendom was subject to the same chaos and mortality that ruled the world outside the basilicas. And yet, amid the turbulence, the figure of Formosus grew larger rather than smaller. Though his body had been humiliated, though his name was alternately praised and damned, the story of his trial became emblematic of the age itself. Chroniclers could not resist describing it, whether to condemn the madness of the judges or to marvel at the strange persistence of his corpse in legend. In time, the Cadaver Synod became less a footnote and more a symbol of vengeance, of instability, of the grotesque extremes of power. By the dawn of the 10th century, Rome was no closer to peace. The papacy continued to pass from hand to hand, often with bloodshed. But beneath the surface, the scars of the Cadaver Synod shaped how the Church thought of itself. Future popes, whatever their politics, would tread more carefully around the memory of Formosus. The trial had shown the world the papacy's most grotesque face, and though it could not be undone, it could serve as a warning. The story of the Cadaver Synod did not vanish with the fall of Stephen VI, nor with the rehabilitation of Formosus under Theodore II and John IX. Instead, it lingered like a shadow over every pope who followed, a reminder that the authority of the papacy could be turned into a weapon, and that the past was never truly safe from the present. In Rome, where memory and rumor carried as much weight as law, the grotesque spectacle became part of the city's collective imagination. Every time a new pope was elected, people wondered whether the turbulence would return, whether the corpse of some other bishop or pontiff might be dragged before the altar to settle political scores. The attempts to erase the synod from official records only made it more vivid in recollection. Stories spread quickly through Europe. Chroniclers outside Rome could scarcely believe what they heard, yet they recorded it nonetheless, often with a mixture of horror and fascination. The image of a corpse, dressed in papal robes, seated on a throne, accused and condemned, was too strange to ignore. Even in an age accustomed to violence and spectacle, it stood apart. It showed that not even death could shield a man from vengeance, and that the dignity of the papal office itself could be twisted into farce. Within Rome, the fallout remained practical as well as symbolic. The bishops ordained by Formosus had been alternately declared illegitimate and restored, depending on the faction in power. This instability undermined the very notion of holy orders. If one pope could annul another's acts by putting his corpse on trial, what certainty could any bishop or priest claim? The chain of ordination, which gave the Church its sense of unbroken continuity, seemed fragile. To faithful Christians, it was unsettling to think that sacraments they had received might be declared invalid because of political maneuvering. The synods that followed tried to resolve these contradictions, but the damage had already been done. Sergius III, who rose to power a few years later with Spoletan's support, revived the condemnation of Formosus. He did not repeat the cadaver trial, perhaps understanding that the memory of it still provoked outrage, but he affirmed its verdict and annulled Formosus's ordinations once again. This decision threw the Church into renewed confusion, as priests and bishops who had been secure under John IX's rehabilitation found themselves questioned again. Sergius's reign was marked by further scandals, and his association with the Cadaver Synod's legacy only deepened the sense that the papacy was trapped in a cycle of vengeance and instability. Beyond Rome, the spectacle became a cautionary tale. In monasteries and courts, scholars discussed it as an example of how far corruption could degrade sacred offices. It was used by critics of the papacy as proof of its fallibility, its vulnerability to politics, its inability to protect even its own dignity. And yet, paradoxically, it also added to the aura of the papacy's uniqueness. No other throne in Christendom could produce such a spectacle, where the boundary between the sacred and the grotesque was so dramatically crossed. For the ordinary faithful, the trial took on almost legendary qualities. Some believed that the strange preservation of Formosus's body, when it was retrieved from the Tiber, was a sign of divine favor, proof that God himself rejected the judgment of the synod. Others whispered that curses had fallen on those who had desecrated him, pointing to the rapid downfall and violent deaths of Stephen VI and his allies. The story became entangled with popular beliefs about the restless dead, about corpses that could not lie still when justice was denied. In the imagination of the people, Formosus was no longer just a pope, but a figure of supernatural endurance, his corpse refusing to be silenced, his memory refusing to decay. Meanwhile, Rome itself descended further into what later historians would call the pornocracy. an era in which the papacy was dominated by powerful families and scandalous intrigues. The Cadaver Synod was not an isolated event but part of a larger pattern, a symptom of a deeper disease. Violence, corruption, and familial power struggles continued to shape the Church for decades, yet the Synod stood out because it captured in one shocking image everything that was wrong with the age. Politics masquerading as justice, vengeance cloaked in sacred robes, the Church consuming itself in public humiliation. Even centuries later, when reformers sought to cleanse the papacy of its stains, they looked back at the Cadaver Synod as the darkest possible example of what could happen when power eclipsed piety. Chroniclers writing in calmer times described it with a mixture of disbelief and shame. How could those entrusted with the care of souls descend to such madness? How could the throne of St. Peter become the stage for such grotesque theater? And yet, they also recognized its inevitability. In a Rome where families fought for dominance, where emperors and dukes treated popes as pawns, where legitimacy was contested at every turn, the trial of a corpse made a perverse kind of sense. It was the ultimate expression of a world where even the dead could not escape the struggles of the living. The Cadaver Synod was not an aberration but a revelation of the system's inner logic, a moment when its corruption was laid bare for all to see. By the 10th century, the memory of the trial had taken on the shape of legend, but its consequences lingered. Every attempt to rehabilitate or condemn Formosus anew showed how the papacy had become entangled in endless cycles of revenge. His name could not be erased, nor could his story be forgotten. He had been a diplomat, a survivor, a pope who navigated the treacherous currents of his time with skill, but it was in death that he achieved a strange kind of immortality. Dragged from his tomb, mocked and mutilated, thrown into a river, he nevertheless endured in memory in chronicler's ink in the uneasy conscience of the Church. The 10th century unfolded as a grim continuation of the chaos that had birthed the Cadaver Synod. The papacy became less a spiritual beacon than the captive prize of Roman aristocratic families, who treated it as property to be distributed among their sons and allies. Chroniclers of later centuries would describe this period with scorn, calling it the rule of the harlots or the iron grip of the Tusculan and Crescentii clan. The papal throne, once envisioned as the seat of Christ's vicar, had been reduced to a chair, passed among competing factions. Against this backdrop, the memory of Formosus and his trial hung like a warning. If the papacy could humiliate one of its own in such grotesque fashion, nothing remained sacred. The influence of the Spoletan dukes persisted, but it was soon eclipsed by the rise of new powers. Noble women such as Theodora and her daughter Marozia came to dominate papal politics, arranging elections, controlling access, and treating popes as instruments of their will. To contemporaries, this was further proof that the papacy had fallen into corruption. To modern historians, it shows how completely the office had become entangled in the daily power struggles of Rome's aristocracy. Yet through it all, the Cadaver Synod was remembered as the moment when politics stripped away all pretense, when the degradation of the Church was revealed in the starkest possible way. Even in distant lands, the story circulated. Monks in Francia copied accounts into their chronicles, marveling that such a thing could have taken place in the city of Peter. Some framed it as divine punishment, God allowing Rome to humiliate itself as retribution for its sins. Others used it as evidence for their arguments about reform. If Rome could put a dead pope on trial, they asked, was it truly the guiding light of the Christian world, or had it become a stumbling block? Within Rome, the pendulum of Formosus's reputation continued to swing. Under Sergius III, his memory had once again been condemned, his ordinations annulled. Later popes quietly restored them, unwilling to reopen wounds, but also unable to ignore the practical need for stability. Bishops consecrated by Formosus continued their work. Priests ordained by him continued to serve, and to deny their legitimacy entirely would have been to unravel the fabric of the Church. Thus, even as his name was cursed from certain pulpits, the reality of his impact endured. The cadaver trial itself entered the realm of rumor and legend. Some said that miracles had attended the recovery of his body from the Tiber, that it had been found incorrupt, a sign of sanctity. Others whispered that those who had touched his corpse at the trial had been struck down by disease or madness, proof that heaven had avenged him. These tales, however exaggerated, reveal the depth of unease that the synod inspired. It was not only an episode of political intrigue, but an affront to the natural order. The dead, in Christian thought, were to rest until resurrection. To disturb that rest for vengeance was to invite cosmic disorder. Meanwhile, the papacy itself became a cautionary example across Christendom. Reformers in monasteries like Cluny looked at Rome and saw decay. To them, the Cadaver Synod was not merely a bizarre event, but the inevitable fruit of unchecked ambition and worldliness in the Church. Their calls for purity, for independence from secular powers, for stricter discipline among clergy, gained urgency against the backdrop of such scandals. Ironically, the grotesque trial of Formosus helped spark movements that would, in time, seek to restore dignity to the papacy. Yet the road to reform was long. Throughout the 10th century, popes continued to rise and fall with frightening speed. Some lasted only weeks before being deposed. Others ruled under the shadow of noble families who treated them as puppets. The authority of the papacy in Europe waned. Kings and emperors looked at Rome and saw weakness, a prize to be taken rather than a partner to be respected. The memory of the Cadaver Synod did nothing to reassure them. If anything, it reinforced the sense that the papacy could not govern itself, that it was vulnerable to every gust of Roman factionalism. In this way, the trial of a corpse continued to shape the destiny of the living. The grotesque scene in the Lateran Basilica in 897 echoed through the halls of power for decades, not because it had resolved any disputes, but because it had laid bare the instability of the entire system. It showed that the papacy, instead of rising above politics, was drowning in them. It showed that vengeance could reach beyond the grave, that legitimacy itself could be undone by the whim of factions. As the century advanced, the papacy would eventually find moments of reform, moments when strong figures tried to reclaim its dignity. But the stain of the Cadaver Synod could not be fully erased. Chroniclers, reformers, and enemies alike returned to it as the clearest evidence of how far the Church could fall. Even when later centuries brought stability and grandeur, the memory of a pope's corpse dragged before a synod remained a specter in the background, a reminder that sanctity was fragile, that institutions could be mocked by their own excesses, and that the line between the sacred and the profane could be obliterated by the hunger for power. Chroniclers of the Middle Ages never forgot the Cadaver Synod. Even when popes tried to erase it from official records, the story found its way into annals and histories, written by monks who shook their heads at the strangeness of it all. To them, it was not only an outrage, but a cautionary tale, a moment when God seemed to withdraw his protection from the papacy and allow it to be mocked by its own hand. The image of a corpse seated on a throne, accused and condemned, captured something essential about the fragility of institutions in a violent world. It was repeated, elaborated, and passed from generation to generation, each retelling sharpening its role as a symbol of the papacy's decline. In Francia, where Carolingian rulers had once relied on the papacy for legitimacy, the story spread quickly. Writers there described it as proof that Rome had sunk into chaos, that the city of Peter was no longer fit to guide Christendom. For emperors in the East, in Constantinople, the tale was ammunition in their own rivalry with the Latin West. They portrayed the Western papacy as corrupt, grotesque, unworthy of its lofty claims. Thus, the Cadaver Synod reverberated far beyond Rome's walls, shaping perceptions of the Church across Europe. Within Rome itself, the memory of the Synod became entangled with superstition. People said that Formosus's corpse, after being pulled from the Tiber, had been miraculously preserved, a sign that he had been unjustly condemned. Some whispered that miracles occurred at his hidden grave, that the dead pope interceded for those who prayed to him in secret. Others told darker stories, that the ghost of Formosus haunted the Lateran Basilica, that moans were heard at night where his body had once been displayed, that curses fell upon those who had mocked him. Whether believed or not, These tales showed how deeply the spectacle had unsettled the Roman imagination. The clergy, too, could not escape its legacy. Bishops ordained by Formosus were haunted by the fear that their authority might be questioned again. Every fluctuation of papal politics threatened to reawaken the controversy. When Sergius III once more condemned Formosus, priests across Italy wondered whether their sacraments were valid, whether their ordinations were secure. This uncertainty struck at the heart of the Church's claim to continuity. If one pope's acts could be annulled by another, what stability remained? The Cadaver Synod had opened a door that could never be fully closed. By the 11th century, reformers who sought to purify the Church often invoked the memory of this synod as the nadir of papal corruption. Monks at Cluny, leaders of the Gregorian reforms, and later chroniclers all looked back on it as the darkest chapter of a dark age. They used it to argue that the papacy needed to be freed from the grip of Roman noble families, that it must rise above the politics that had dragged it into such grotesque theater. For them, the corpse of Formosus on trial was the perfect symbol of what happened when the sacred was enslaved to worldly ambition. And yet, even as it was condemned, the story fascinated. Medieval imagination thrived on the macabre, on visions of corpses speaking, of justice pursued beyond the grave, of divine punishment revealed in strange ways. The Cadaver Synod seemed almost like a morality play, a grotesque parable acted out in the heart of Christendom. For some, it showed the vanity of human power, that even popes could be stripped and humiliated. For others, it was a sign of God's inscrutable will, that he allowed such a scandal to humble the proud. In later centuries, artists and writers would return to it as a symbol of madness and corruption. Renaissance scholars, rediscovering the chronicles, retold the story with both disgust and fascination. Enlightenment critics of the Church used it as evidence of the irrationality of religion. Modern historians analyze it as a window into the brutal politics of the age, a moment when legitimacy itself was a weapon, and even the dead were not spared. Each retelling kept alive the image that had so disturbed its first witnesses, the lifeless figure of Pope Formosus, dressed in the robes of power, accused by the living, judged by those who should have been his successors, and condemned in the name of vengeance, disguised as justice. The Cadaver Synod thus lived on as both memory and symbol. It was the story of one pope's humiliation, but more than that, it was the story of an institution revealing its darkest face. It showed the world what happened when power consumed piety, when politics devoured sanctity. And though centuries passed, the shadow of that trial remained, a ghost at the edge of every coronation, every decree, every attempt to claim that the papacy was unbroken and eternal. As the centuries unfolded, the Cadaver Synod refused to fade quietly into obscurity. The grotesque image of a pope's corpse, tried in full regalia, became one of those stories that seemed almost too strange to be true, yet too striking ever to be forgotten. Chroniclers, moralists, and satirists alike returned to it whenever they sought an example of how deeply the papacy could fall into corruption. For them, it was not just a historical episode, but a mirror held up to the nature of power itself, how it could twist justice into spectacle, faith into mockery, and memory into a weapon. By the High Middle Ages, when the papacy began to assert itself once more, as a force above kings and emperors, the Cadaver Synod lingered in the background as an uncomfortable reminder. Reform movements of the 11th and 12th centuries, particularly those inspired by the ideals of Cluny and later by Pope Gregory VII, painted the earlier centuries as a time of darkness from which the Church needed deliverance. The Synod fit perfectly into this narrative. It was the nadir, the example par excellence of what happened when the papacy was enslaved to Roman noble factions and worldly intrigue. By invoking the memory of Formosus and his trial, reformers could sharpen their call for change, for independence from secular lords, for a papacy free from the humiliation of family feuds. Outside Rome, the story acquired a different flavor. In France, England, and Germany, writers used it as a way to criticize Rome itself, portraying the eternal city not as a beacon of holiness, but as a place of madness and corruption. In Byzantine circles, where rivalry with the Latin Church ran deep, The Synod was pointed to as proof of the West's degeneration. The idea that a corpse had been enthroned, interrogated, and condemned in the very heart of Western Christendom seemed to them almost like a parody of sacred tradition. It was ammunition in the polemics that widened the gulf between East and West. Within popular imagination, the Cadaver Synod also took on legendary qualities. Tales circulated that the Tiber itself had rejected the body of Formosus, that it had floated back to the banks as though carried by divine will. Some said miracles were worked at the spot where his remains were recovered, that pilgrims who prayed there were healed of sickness. Others believed curses had befallen those who had participated in the trial, pointing to the violent deaths and misfortunes of Stephen VI and his allies as proof. Whether believed literally or not, these stories reveal how the Synod had become more than history. It was part of Rome's folklore, a tale of divine justice acting in strange and terrible ways. Later medieval art and literature occasionally alluded to the Synod, though often obliquely. The grotesque image of a corpse in judgment lent itself easily to allegory. Writers could use it to symbolize hypocrisy, the futility of earthly power, or the inevitability of divine reckoning. Though rarely illustrated directly, the story haunted the imagination of those who reflected on the fragility of human institutions. It was as though the figure of Formosus, seated lifeless yet accused, became a symbol of all authority that pretended to stand above corruption, but was itself consumed by it. By the 13th and 14th centuries, when the papacy had grown into a vast bureaucracy with claims over kings and kingdoms, the Cadaver Synod was sometimes invoked by critics to remind the Church of its darker past. Reformers and heretical movements alike pointed to it as evidence that Rome had long been capable of grotesque sin. If a pope's corpse could be tried in open court, they argued, then clearly the papacy was not immune from error or folly. Even when the papacy reached new heights of power, crowned with the splendor of Avignon in the Renaissance, the memory of that trial lingered, like a whisper in the background, an old wound that could never be entirely healed. It is striking that no later pope ever attempted such a spectacle again. Though political trials and bitter condemnations would continue, the trial of a corpse remained unique. It was as though the Church itself had recoiled from the enormity of what it had done, recognizing that some lines could not be crossed twice. And yet, the story's endurance in chronicles and memory shows how deeply it had scarred the papacy. No decree could erase it, no rehabilitation could undo it. The Cadaver Synod had become a permanent part of the story of Rome, a reminder that the throne of St. Peter had once been reduced to a stage for vengeance beyond the grave. When the Renaissance dawned, with its hunger for rediscovery of the past and its fascination with the bizarre and the grotesque, the Cadaver Synod re-emerged in scholarly circles. Humanist historians digging into medieval chronicles stumbled across the tale, often pausing in disbelief. To men and women who prized classical balance and dignity, the idea of a pope's corpse enthroned and placed on trial seemed like something drawn from satire rather than sober record. And yet, there it was, preserved in the annals, a stark reminder of an age when Rome itself had seemed consumed by madness. Renaissance writers retold the story not only as history, but also as moral allegory. They pointed to it as evidence of what happened when sacred institutions surrendered to base passions, when political vendettas dressed themselves in the garments of justice. As the centuries moved into the Age of Reformation, the Cadaver Synod found new life in polemics. Protestants, eager to undermine the authority of Rome, seized upon the story as proof of papal corruption. Pamphlets described the grotesque spectacle with relish, portraying it as the ultimate example of how the papacy could be twisted into absurdity. Reformers argued that if the papacy had once been capable of such madness, then it could hardly claim to be an unbroken and divinely guided institution. In their hands, the trial of Formosus became less a tale of one pope's humiliation than a weapon in the larger struggle against Rome's authority. The Enlightenment sharpened this critique further. Philosophers and historians of the 18th century, skeptical of religion and eager to expose its follies, retold the story with biting irony. Voltaire, ever ready to mock clerical abuses, cited the Cadaver Synod as an example of superstition run wild. To Enlightenment thinkers, the image of bishops interrogating a corpse epitomized the irrationality they believed lay at the heart of organized religion, and it was used as a convenient anecdote to illustrate the dangers of dogma, the absurdities that arose when institutions clung to power without reason. Yet even as it was ridiculed, the synod fascinated. The sheer strangeness of it captured imaginations across Europe. Historians, satirists, and even artists could not resist the macabre scene, the pale body of a pope, dressed in rich vestments, propped up on a throne, the flickering light of candles casting shadows across hollow eye sockets while living men shouted accusations at him. The drama of it seemed almost theatrical, and in the hands of later writers, it became a stage upon which larger arguments about power, corruption, and human folly were played out. In Catholic circles, the memory was more complex. Officially, the Church distanced itself from the Synod, treating it as the aberrant act of a deranged age. Yet Catholic historians could not deny it had happened. Some sought to downplay it, burying the tale in footnotes or treating it as a regrettable episode in an otherwise holy institution. Others, especially in the Counter-Reformation, turned the story into a cautionary example of why reform within the Church had been necessary. By acknowledging the darkness of the past, they sought to highlight the light of renewal. In this way, the Cadaver Synod moved beyond its medieval origins to become a story retold in every age according to its own concerns. For the Renaissance, it was a grotesque relic of barbarous times. For Protestants, a weapon against papal claims. For Enlightenment critics, proof of the absurdity of religion. For Catholics, a shameful stain to be admitted or explained away. The trial of Formosus became more than a moment in Roman politics. It became a symbol adaptable to whatever argument the age required. By the modern era, historians began to approach it with a different lens. Rather than treating it simply as an oddity or a scandal, they sought to understand it in its context, as the product of 9th century Rome's fractured politics. They examined the Spoletan dukes, the ambitions of emperors, the precarious balance of papal legitimacy, and they saw in the Cadaver Synod less a mad outburst than the logical outcome of a world where power depended on rewriting the past. It was, they argued, not a freak exception, but the clearest expression of the politics of its time. Still, for all the scholarly explanations, the enduring power of the Cadaver Synod lies in its imagery. Even today, it remains one of the most infamous episodes in papal history, invoked whenever discussions turn to the corruption and instability of the medieval Church. More than 1,000 years later, the sight of a corpse on trial continues to haunt imagination and scholarship alike, a reminder that history is sometimes stranger than myth. More than a millennium has passed since that winter day in 897, when the corpse of Pope Formosus was dragged from its tomb and enthroned in the Lateran Basilica. Yet the Cadaver Synod still refuses to die. Its memory endures because it is more than a curious footnote. It is a window into the instability of an age, a mirror of the human hunger for power, and a parable about the dangers of vengeance when cloaked in sacred robes. To study it is to glimpse the world of 9th century Rome in all its turbulence, its mixture of sanctity and brutality, its uneasy dance between politics and faith. Formosus himself was no saintly victim in the usual sense. He was a skilled diplomat, an ambitious cleric, and a survivor in a brutal world. He courted powerful patrons, played factions against each other, and reached the highest throne of Christendom by navigating the treacherous waters of Italian politics. His enemies were not entirely wrong to suspect his ambitions. Yet the grotesque humiliation of his corpse turned him into something larger than life. In death, he became a symbol of the papacy's degradation, a reminder that even the dead could be made to serve the struggles of the living. For Stephen VI and the Spoletan dukes, the synod was meant to be a tool. By condemning Formosus, they sought to erase his legacy, to invalidate his ordinations, to secure their own claim to legitimacy. In the short term, perhaps they succeeded, but history was less kind to them than they had hoped. Stephen's own fall was swift and brutal. His strangling in prison followed almost immediately after the synod. His name survives now only as a cautionary figure, remembered primarily for the madness of the trial he presided over. The Spoletan dukes themselves faded into history's shadows, their moment of triumph swallowed by the very chaos they had tried to control. The Cadaver Synod's true legacy lay not in its immediate outcomes, but in the wound it left on the papacy's image. Even after repeated rehabilitations of Formosus, even after later popes forbade such trials of corpses, the damage could not be undone. The idea that a pope's decrees could be annulled in such grotesque fashion undermined confidence in the Church's stability. The notion that vengeance could pursue a man into his grave suggested that no sanctity was secure. The spectacle, preserved in chronicles and repeated through centuries, became shorthand for the corruption of the age. Through the Middle Ages, it haunted reformers who longed to free the papacy from aristocratic factions. Through the Reformation, it served as a weapon for Protestants eager to discredit Rome. Through the Enlightenment, it was retold with irony, proof of religion's absurdities. And in modern times, it remains a story that captures the imagination because of its sheer strangeness. Historians analyze it for its political logic, artists and writers revisit it for its macabre drama, and the wider world recalls it as the moment when the sacred throne of St. Peter became the stage for the most grotesque trial in history. Perhaps that is why the Cadaver Synod continues to fascinate. It reveals with unflinching clarity how fragile human institutions are, even those that claim divine protection. It shows how ambition, fear, and vengeance can twist rituals of justice into acts of cruelty, how the desire to control the past can lead to spectacles that scar the future. In its bizarre theater, we glimpse not only the madness of one age, but also the enduring truth that power, when unchecked, will stop at nothing, not even at the grave. And so the story of Formosus lives on. His bones have long since turned to dust, his tomb forgotten, his enemies gone. But the memory of his trial remains vivid, recorded in the ink of chroniclers, retold across centuries, whispered as a warning. Rome has seen emperors rise and fall, dynasties fade, and even the papacy transform itself again and again. Yet somewhere, in the collective memory of history, the ghost of a pope in decayed vestments still sits on a throne in the Lateran, silent while the living rage against him. A reminder that the past can never be fully buried and that the search for legitimacy can sometimes descend into the grotesque.